financial disclosure, but just so you all know that this is being recorded, so future volunteers and the public can also learn from this. It'll be posted on the SAMO Fund's YouTube page. And if you don't love that, you can keep your face off the screen or not join us, but we hope that you stay and hear Joey, because I think you might have all been on for Antonio Sanchez a couple weeks ago, and he went over like 72 different projects they're working on. Well, Joey's his supervisor and has other things to share. So that's pretty incredible that there's more to learn. So we're excited about that. Joey, thank you so much for taking this on, and take it away.
Thanks for having me. All right, let's do this. And thank you everyone for joining. How's that looking?
Good.
All right.
Very nice.
All right. Yeah, so I'm Joey Algiers. I'm the restoration ecologist for the Santa Monica Mountains National Recreation Area, your National Park Service, the National Park for Los Angeles and surrounding communities. And I want to talk about restoration, why we do restoration, the significance of it, and how we rely very heavily on volunteers to get that work done. I always tell people, there's myself, I'm a permanent restoration ecologist. There's my direct supervisor, John Tisler, our plant ecologist, and that's it. We have a botanist who is, there's funding, but it's temporary. So really the way that we get work done is by working with school groups, with volunteers from the community. And we have several volunteers who are really just part of our veg team who just come out on a regular basis. I think some of them might be on the call today. We have Sonia, Michelle, Aya, just wonderful volunteers who keep our nursery running, working with Antonio Sanchez, but then also going out and doing restoration work as well, putting plants in the ground. All right, let's see. Yeah. Okay, so this is our park. We're kind of, you know, many of you probably, I recognize some faces who already know this information, but I'll just go over a brief kind of background on our park and how we're unique and a little bit weird, I guess you could say. This is our park, so this boundary right here, that is our National Park Service unit for the Santa Monica Mountains. National Park Service owns 15% of that. All the stuff you see in green here, though, is protected, which is almost half of the mountains. So we work with other partners like state parks, MRCA, MRT, other nonprofit agencies that are about preserving and protecting this beautiful area. But it's also about half the mountains, or a little bit more, is owned by private land, city, that kind of stuff. So it makes our park really interesting. We're just like Yosemite or Grand Canyon, except we're way cooler because we're in the backyard of Los Angeles, one of the largest cities in the world. But it also makes it a lot more difficult to control what comes in and out of our park. The 101 freeway is running through here. Many of you have driven through the recreation area, right? Even if you haven't been inside of it. Or many of you live inside the recreation area as well. So it makes it interesting and dynamic. And then this, of course, is just the philosophy behind it, that we're preserving and protecting the natural and cultural resources now for us, but also for future and current generations, for current and future generations, so that individuals 100, 500 years from now can come to our national park and have the same experience that we have had as well. So it's kind of something that's bigger than us, which is pretty cool. A lot of people say it's the best idea America's had. I'm not sure about that, but it's a pretty darn good idea, and I'm humbled to be a part of it. So here's our work site. We are the largest urban national park in the world, which is pretty impressive. I always tell people, if you ever get lost hiking in the Santa Monica Mountains, just yell for help and someone will probably open their back door. You're never really too far from a road or a house. There's somebody waiting with you with a cup of hot coffee or something. People can get lost out there. There are some pretty remote areas, but it's pretty neat to think that you have this huge highly populated city here. And you can drive 10, 20 minutes and you can clear your mind, get away from the traffic, the congestion, have a place to reflect, to recreate, and then you can head back to the busy city. I grew up in Burbank. I spent a lot of time hiking in the Santa Monica Mountains. I didn't know what it was really. I thought it was Forest Service or something. I didn't realize it was a national park. But it's pretty cool to be working there now and visiting those same places and helping manage them for other people to enjoy as well. Now, when it comes to California, this is why a big reason why the national park was established in the Santa Monica Mountains. It's not just because of the people that were there as a recreation area, but there's also really important resources that occur along the entire coast of California. California in general is wicked cool when it comes to resources. We've got an amazing climate, hot, dry summers, cool, wet winters. It never gets too extreme, which is why a lot of people want to live here. We have really cool geology and varied soils. We've got soils like serpentine soils that occur only in the along the coast of California and nowhere else in the world. Complex topography. Of course, we have fires. We have a vegetation that is adapted to periodic fire, and then high hybridization. A lot of species that aren't quite sure yet what they are. And so that's a big reason why the Santa Monica Mountains is protected. It's got some of the best examples of the resources that we have in California. And I think, you know, I know some of you are way into resources. Maybe some of you aren't. But I'll tell you what my systematics instructor told me, professor told me when I was taking plant taxonomy. She said, this is the most, what did she say? This is the most important class you'll ever take, because if you can learn how to key out plants, you will never be bored again. You can take that skill with you anywhere in the world and figure out what things are. And that's really true for all resources. If you go outside and you are looking at something green and you notice that that thing green is different than that other thing that's green, now your brain starts working and you can have a lifetime of fun trying to figure out what things are. And then you start seeing how things are related to each other and how they look similar. And oh, they evolved from a similar ancestor. That's why they have those traits. And the mind starts exploding, right? You can go to different parts of the world and you can see those similar things and how they act in similar ways, but they're not quite the same. Anyway, I highly recommend it. And if you're just starting off with resources, I say a good way to start off is to look at our state resources. So feel free to chime in if you want to chat. What is this? This is our state tree. Does anyone know what this is? Sorry, I can hear my kids out there. Let's see. Did anyone say? I can't see.
Redwood.
Yes, the redwood, right? I think our state tree is the coast redwood and the giant sequoia. That's considered our state tree. Coast redwood, tallest tree in the world. Giant sequoia, arguably the largest organism by mass, right, in the entire world. We have that in California. If you think about the Central Coast, how amazing that is. Those meadows with the gigantic, amazing trees that don't look real. That's California. California's got amazing resources. All right, this is our state amphibian. I often show this slide and no one's gotten it yet. It's a curveball on the second resource. Nobody knows? Any guesses? Going once, twice? The red-legged frog. Yes, did you know, Tori?
Yeah, I was just gonna chime in.
Very cool. Yeah, so the red-legged frog, probably the reason people don't know that is because it's been extirpated from much of California. Actually from our mountains as well, but our wildlife biologists have recently reintroduced several populations of red-legged frogs into the Santa Monica Mountains. Again, they were extirpated though, means basically they were locally extinct from the mountains back in the 70s, but pretty cool that they're coming back. Okay, this is our state bird.
California quail.
California quail. Yes, you know it. Chicago, Chicago. Nope, you're in California. You hear that? All right. Our state mammal. This is probably the only place you'll see it.
Grizzly bear.
Grizzly bear.
Grizzly bear, which has also been extirpated from California. We're probably not doing a very good job of managing our resources in California if all our state organisms are disappearing, but there it is. State fish.
Garibaldi.
Yes, the flying Garibaldi, migrating over the Antelope Valley every year. No, that's our state. That is our state fish. And then, of course, below it, our state flower of the exact same color. Shout it with me, the California poppy. Yes, very good. All right, anyway, that's one way to start off. If you guys know about iNaturalist, if you don't, if you're phone savvy at all, I highly suggest it. You can take pictures. It'll actually tell you what the resources are because there's so many pictures. They've developed this like search engine that will tell you, oh, that's a California poppy. You know, it's not right all the time, but oftentimes it gets you down pretty close and in the right place, you know, of where to look. I mean, I just think it's amazing that like you'll take a picture of the flower and it'll tell you it's the California poppy. It won't tell you it's a Garibaldi, which is impressive, right? Okay, so here's a picture of the Mediterranean climates throughout the world. There's not many of them. There's only 5. If you look at all the land that's out there, what's in red, that's the California, that's the Mediterranean climates. And we're over here in California. It has to do with the relationship with the sun around 30 degrees latitude. That's why we get those hot, dry summers and the cool, wet winters. It's what anywhere that you go that's Mediterranean is highly populated. Everybody's living there because the weather is just awesome. But because of that, also, you have a lot of damage that's happened to the resources because of all the human activity in those areas. And that brings us to a bigger classification, the biodiversity hotspots, if you've heard of these. And these are all the biodiversity hotspots across the world. All the Mediterranean regions are in biodiversity hotspots. If you're in California along the coast, you are sitting in the biodiversity hotspot right now. And the Santa Monica Mountains are inside that biodiversity hotspot. The way that we classify biodiversity hotspots is we say that they are very high in biodiversity, meaning that they have a lot of different species. There's ways that we measure biodiversity, but the gist of it is that there's a lot of different stuff out there. They have what's called very high endemism, meaning that those resources occur in those areas and nowhere else in the world, and they are suffering, right? So the Mediterranean regions are a great example of that. Lots of stuff going on, lots of resources, lots of cool stuff along the California coast. They've been suffering, can't find them anywhere else in the world. So here's California, and this is talking about the plants, and this is the biodiversity hotspot. It's not the whole state of California, but it is the entire coast, and it spills out, you know, down into Baja and up in Oregon a little bit. And this is the biodiversity hotspot that's here. Santa Monica Mountains are right around here. And you can see 37% of our plant species occur only in this area and nowhere else in the world. And we've lost about 70% of the primary vegetation, which means the initial vegetation has been altered in some way. A lot of it's coming back, a lot of it's not. But just again, to give you an idea, let's say you started hiking here in Oregon, you're like going through and you're collecting data on the different plant species that you see. You're like, wow, cool, that's great. And then you start coming over here and you start moving up here and you're collecting data on the plant species that you see. You're writing down everything you see. Over a third of the species that you saw over here, you're not going to see over here, right? And as you continue to move east, the difference between these areas is not going to be quite as great. Again, highlighting California is awesome when it comes to resources. Of course, there's awesome stuff everywhere, but 37% of the plant species, that's really something else. And here's just looking at Mediterranean regions in general, it only makes up a little more than 2% of the world's land area, but we've got 16% of the world's plant species or more that occur in Mediterranean regions. So in the Santa Monica Mountains, we have about 1,000 native species, native plant species, over 300 species that are non-native. And of those 300, we consider 100 of them to be invasive. So what that means is they have come from a different location. They've been introduced into California, into our region, and they are spreading beyond the point of introduction. Now, the reason that's concerning is because they are now in a new area where they are lacking the challenges that they had back home. So there's a lot of potential for them to cause a lot of harm. Invasive species are one of the biggest threats to our planet with respect to biodiversity and a number of other issues as well. I bring it up because we spend a lot of time treating invasive species. We have a weed warrior program that you can get involved in, which is hand pulling and the manual removal with tools of invasive species. It's probably the most important component, in my opinion, of restoration, which is also the most, I think, underappreciated and misunderstood as well. But if we can just control the weeds, we would do so much better with the natives, the stuff that is getting swamped out by these aggressive invasive species. So we focus on 25. We treat a little bit more than that when we can, but there's 25 that we're mostly concerned with because we just can't treat them all. And it all started with this gentleman, Christopher Columbus, who started traveling around the world, and that got a real, it sparked real interest in traveling around the world. We're now at the point where we bounce continents on a daily basis, not so much lately with COVID, but in general, this is part of what we do. We bring stuff around and we introduce it to different parts of the world. So if you're bringing resources from, let's say from Europe, and you're bringing it over here and it's getting introduced into North America, then you have those resources that are unique to certain parts of the world, like the biodiversity hotspot along California, that are being threatened. And so now, instead of just having black mustard and annual grasses that occur in Europe, you have them also now in California. And the stuff that's unique in California is being pushed out. And so they're calling it this planet of weeds, where we're seeing on a global scale, biodiversity is dropping. We're losing species at a very rapid rate every single day. And we are making everything in our planet the same. They call it the homogeneity. We're homogenizing our planet. This is E.O. Wilson, who says on a global basis, the two great destroyers of biodiversity are first habitat destruction and second invasion by exotic species. I gotta say, I agree. And so, so if you do want to get involved in our Weed Warrior program, it's us controlling plants that occur in areas that we don't want them. That's how we define weeds. And the harm is not only to the environment, you'd also be helping out because there is harm to the economy as well. We work with the Department of Agriculture they've identified a weed on our land recently that they're very concerned about because they don't want it in agricultural settings interrupting our ability to grow food. But there's also harm to human health. It forms very prickly vegetation that occurs along trails. It's very difficult for animals to move through there and for yourself as well. This is a poison hemlock species that is crowding out native vegetation. And it's also, like the name says, it's poisonous. So some people have gotten harmed, like this gentleman, Socrates, who was asking too many questions, and they made him drink poison hemlock tea. But it happens even in modern day. This is the flower, the inflorescence of poison hemlock. It looks a lot like sweet fennel, which is edible if you've ever cooked with fennel. And I know the story of a Boy Scout troop who collected a bunch of sweet fennel seed for their soup, and they all got violently ill because it turned out it was poison hemlock. And they didn't even ask any interesting questions. Just happened to be there. The other issue is that it does block easement ways and maybe even signage. If you notice in the top left corner here, the sign says there's a 100-foot drop behind, no, I'm just kidding. It says there's something about authorized vehicles, and But I mean, the point stands, right? Like this is what happens. And this is vegetation that has grown all within 1 year. So meaning at the beginning of the year, there was nothing there. It was down to the ground and it grew very quickly. This is the advantage that they have. These annual species grow like crazy. This is another species, tumbleweed, which crowds out the trails. You can't drive down it. You can't ride your horse down it. Can't ride your bike down it. Again, this is all in less than a year. This thing was down to the ground and in less than a year. I can't even think of a native species that grows and spreads as fast as our invasive species do. It's really an extreme challenge having to control these species for recreational purposes, for ecological purposes, for human health purposes, all the above. I just want to show you, this is the work that we've done where we started off maybe about 60 net acres of infestations, and we brought it down to a couple acres, and the Woolsey fire brought it back to about 9 or 10 acres, but we're still down pretty low compared to where we used to be. And now we just got the 2020 data in, and we're back low again. So we've been staying on top of it, keeping it look good. And if you get involved with us, you can do some removal. So this is 2011, the first time of sweet fennel has been treated. 2012, you can see we start knocking it out. 2014, even lower. 2015, and now 2020, it's pretty much gone. So this is our team. If you did want to join, we would train you on how to identify, the weeds and how to treat them, and maybe how to do a backflip or something, depending on how enthusiastic you are about it. This is our nursery manager and volunteer coordinator, Antonio Sanchez, that gave a talk not too long ago, and here he is pulling up tree tobacco with high schoolers. We also remove vegetation in the post-fire environment. You can see a bunch of native canyon sunflower over here. We're removing Italian thistle that occurs around the sunflower and around the beautiful large flowered phacelias that came up after the fire. So yeah, this is like what I think I do and what I actually do. My friends think I do. Okay, restoration. Now we're talking about putting plants in the ground. Ooh, much better turnout for restoration than for weed work. People like putting native plants in the ground, especially when it's trees. And we've got a lot of trees going in this year, probably about 6,000 trees that we're aiming to put in, native trees. And so I do want to talk about our restoration projects that we have going on. The other thing people like to do is they like to throw stuff. Here's a stinking gourd seed that's being thrown. So I'm trying to figure out more ways to have people throw stuff just to bring them out and to recruit them. People like throwing seeds and seed bombs and that kind of stuff. But there's really nothing more thrilling than putting a tree in the ground, I have to admit. We work with school groups, high school groups, anyone really. A lot of private companies will come out too and do work with us. And like I said, we have some rock star volunteers who are really just part of our veg team now. And those are all options to you if you're interested in volunteering with us. Here's some pictures of what restoration looks like, sort of, right? This is an area that was burned at Rancho Sierra Vista, and we put in all of these native shrubs that you see here. We also identify important areas. So up on the hillside of this photo here, there's cactus scrub vegetation, which is a subset of coastal sage scrub. It's a globally rare vegetation type. And it's really important for roadrunners and even cactus wren, although we don't have any at Rancho Sierra Vista. It'd be nice to create that habitat as an option. Who knows, in the future they could show up. And so we put in native shrubs. This is all buckwheat and native California sagebrush, purple sage, that kind of stuff. Sometimes it's just removing the weeds that are in an area to try to reveal what's below. This is all wild radish. Look at this crazy patch of wild radish. We remove it to reveal underneath yerba mansa in this wetland area. This is a really cool spot because we don't see a lot of wetlands that are dominated by yerba mansa. Wetlands in general across California have really suffered because they're generally these flat areas. They're really good for development. Like a shopping mall would look really good right here, you know, like just put it right there. Everything, you know, put some drains in there. But what we're doing here is we're revealing the yerba mansa below, and then you can see we put a bunch of shrubs in there as well. And this is just to give you a before and after 2016. You can see the yerba mansa area and where we planted this. These are all baby plantings. And now from that same view, we have in 2020, these are all native shrubs. We've really transformed this area. These yellow flowers are invasive prickly ox tongue that are still kind of creeping their way up. But once we get the natives in there, they do a really good job of controlling the weeds. And just to give you an idea, the wild radish before, right? Look at the difference. That's quite a difference. We still can go around. Volunteers will go around and kind of garden these areas, try to keep the weeds down and continue to encourage the native growth. And those natives are dropping seed now, right? So they're replenishing the seed bank with natives, and that's going to be the future of this area. Okay, I wanted to show you a restoration from outer space. This is the Two Winds restoration at the RSV nursery. If you're familiar with Rancho Sierra Vista, this is the RSV nursery right here. And see how there's a kind of like this creek area that's sort of outlined. You guys can see my mouse, right? Going over it?
Yeah.
Okay. So this picture's, I think, from 1994. They started putting stuff in 2002. And this is 2019 now. So look at that difference, right? Pretty amazing. There's now a whole bunch of native vegetation here, and it's a thriving riparian community. And I'll show you just a close-up look, because this is where it was most obvious, 1994. And I'll show you kind of a time series of the restoration. 2002, you can see they started putting some shrubs in. You guys see that there? They're putting in trees, sycamores, oaks, all the way along here. 2005, now stuff's starting to show up a little bit. 2007, hey, starting to look good. 2011, this is actually really good. And we have full-grown sycamores now, which are here, which they don't show up as green because they lose their leaves. So it's just the time of year that it's taken. 2012, 2015, and 2018, 2019. This is, again, a thriving riparian area. Earlier this year, I saw a couple of bobcats smacking each other over here in the tree. It was awesome. Cooper's hawks, owls, you name it. That's happening here. I'm sure that wasn't happening before, right? This is all nice, high quality nesting habitat. And it's used as corridors for the larger animals as well. I want to show you it again, kind of sped up. Restoration in front of you. So the best time to look at a restoration really is 5-10 years from the time of the restoration, 20 years later. But that's going to continue. As long as no one cuts that down, that's going to continue forever, right? People 500 years from now can come by and see this thriving riparian area that will hopefully have expanded by that point as well. So I mentioned there's a lot of interest after the Woolsey fire to help rehabilitate these areas. We did lose a lot of oak trees. We lost a lot of native vegetation. And I think there's just an overall appreciation that's growing for the importance of having healthy native communities that are resilient to this increased fire frequency, to climate change, to all sorts of things. And so we had this event in October of 2019. We put in over 3,000 plants with over 750 volunteers in a single day. It's the largest single day planting that we've ever done. And there's been a lot of support for trying to build upon these efforts. Like I mentioned, when you think of Los Angeles, we have such an amazing population there that's interested in these natural areas. And you look at some of these volunteer efforts that have happened around the world, like these major beach cleanups, where they bring out thousands of people to clean up beaches, to and to do just all sorts of work. And there's no reason to think that we can't do the same sort of thing in the Santa Monica Mountains. We certainly have the people and the interest. And so it's just us right now growing our program and trying to figure out how to do this. And we do it with the help of everyone from the park, a lot of help from Interp, from volunteer coordination, facilities, law enforcement. And I see these events as being sort of like these mini festivals that we could have multiple events every year to try to better our lands and then get people involved and to learn about the parks, get them outside and have them take part in bettering their land. So here's the restoration projects that we're doing this year. Chesborough Canyon, this is not a great map, but all of this green area here, we're going to be fixing up this riparian area. And then this red area here, we're putting in coastal sage scrub plants. There's going to be about 1,500 trees, willows and oaks that are going into this area, along with 5,000 coastal sage scrub plants. So about 6,500 plants there. Paramount Ranch, this whole green area here is where we're planting trees, another 1,500 trees, and we'll be putting associated species as well, another 5,000. So another 6,500 plants over there as well. RSP Potrero, we're putting in 3,000 oak trees to expand this riparian area and an additional 5,000 associated species. So we'll have 8,000 plants in this year. And all this work this year is being, it's being funded by One Tree Planted, which is an amazing partner that we're working with. We worked with last year and again this year. And then Yerba Mansa will be putting in 10,000 plants here. We're trying to expand on the riparian area the wetland area I showed you with the Yerba Mansa dominated vegetation. There's a nice coastal sage cactus scrub area up here. We'll be moving into this grassland and expanding this way as well. And then lastly, what I'm interested in is looking at our native wildfires native wildflowers and trying to build up our seed collection program. So we got a grant from the National Park Foundation to really beef up our seed program so that we can have large collections of seed from all over the mountains of native plants. And there's different restoration strategies, one called strip seeding, where it's kind of like agriculture, but you go through and you put strips of native plants that that fill in over time, and it's a quick way to do restoration. And so I'm really interested in pursuing this and trying to go after some of these nice wildflowers, like especially in our flatter areas and areas where we're trying to preserve a cultural landscape to keep things open looking, but to convert it, to transform it from annual grasses to these beautiful wildflowers. And so that's Antonio Sanchez is doing a lot of that work where he's out collecting seed with youth, but getting the public involved as well to try to bulk up our seed collection so we can really start pursuing some of these large scale transformations of these areas to dominated by native vegetation.
So Joey, quick question. So how are the sites and lines for replantings determined? Like, how do you guys plan that?
How do we plan? I'm sorry, what was the question?
How do you determine the replantings, like the sites and the lines, the boundaries?
Yeah, so it's usually based on, a lot of it is determined by funding availability, and it depends on the project. So some of the cactus scrub vegetation restoration that I showed you was funded by post-fire rehabilitation money. So, after fires, there's a lot of money and good support for weed control, but there's also money for putting plants in the ground. And so, depending on the availability of money, we will say, like that cactus scrub restoration, for example, I believe it was like 26 acres. So there was enough funding for 26 acres. And so they pursued it for that purpose. The Yerba Mansa, for example, that was a project that was youth funded. So we got funding to do that project, but we needed to do it with a youth group. And we worked with Northeast Trees, which is a group out of East Los Angeles. They recruit high school students to do restoration. And it was particularly to improve bird habitat, right? But because of the fact that it was a wetland that was dominated by yerba mansa, and that's not something we see very often, it's kind of a rarity, that gave a lot of strength to the project, right? Because we were protecting something that's unusual and special. I hope that helps. But yeah, I think it does really kind of depend on the money. If you give me $100 million, we'll restore the whole mountains, right? But it depends on where the funding is, and it's us being creative in figuring out how to make it something meaningful. Because there's always more work than we could possibly do, unfortunately. But because of that, we try to prioritize what we find to be most important, but also what's going to get support as well. Anyway, that's it for me. So if you want to volunteer, if this is interesting to you, I mean, I'll answer questions now as well. But you can reach samo_volunteer@nps.gov, right? And sign up and get on our mailing list. We will tell you when we're doing these events. We often send out invitations through Eventbrite. And of course, with COVID, it's made things a little bit tricky. So we ask for patience and flexibility, but we are working on ways to get people back out there and are doing it on a limited level, at least. Now, if what I was talking about before, like you're interested and you're thinking, well, I'd like to come out to the nursery on a regular basis, or I'd really like to be involved in restoration on a weekly basis. Yes, Samo, volunteers, that email there is a good place to reach out to, but you can also reach out to me directly. And I can fill you in, we could talk, and I can tell you kind of what we do on a day-to-day basis. And then of course there's Antonio Sanchez as well, our nursery manager, who can also talk with you about the details of what we do on a day-to-day basis to see if you want to get involved on a more regular basis.
Man, Joey, I didn't have that much fun weed whacking with you like that picture.
No, really? Backwards?
That's a pretty neat picture. We do have one question. Which native plants are most in need of restoration, in your opinion, at our park?
Yeah, which native plants? So when I mentioned the endemism in California, how there's 37% of our plant species occur only along the California coast in that biodiversity hotspot. There are actually 2 species that occur only in the Santa Monica Mountains. Believe it or not. So those are Verides dudleya and Lyons paniquita. So if there are 2 species that are in most need of restoration, I would say it's those 2 species, because we are at real risk of losing those 2 species. And if we lose them in the wild, if there's anything we could learn from them, a technology, a medicine, an experience that people in the future could have with this species, we will never know it. So those are the 2 most important, I would say. The dudleya, the Verides dudleya is down to less than 1,000 individuals, I think. There were over 4,000 individuals before the 2013 Springs fire, and that fire burned all 6 populations, which were very close to each other, knocking it down to about 300 individuals. Since then, there's been a small rebound, but there was years of drought, as we all know. And so it was very difficult for them to respond. We are planning restoration. Well, so we're doing conservation work with that species, where we're growing it at our native plant nursery with the idea that we will repatriate it back into the wild at some point. And we do have restoration planned for Paniquita leonii, but it's much more cautious restoration, I should say, than the general, these other projects that we're doing, although they're extremely important. We are working in areas that are dominated by non-native vegetation, and we are converting them back to native cover.
Oh, so this is a really great question. So at what time period are we trying to restore our parks? Are we looking at pre-Columbus contact or pre-Chumash? And do we know what was here then and where it was?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. For the most part, pre-Columbian, although the Park Service has a number of different requirements. So I did mention this briefly before about the cultural landscape, for example. So there are areas that are preserved in the Santa Monica Mountains that are, for example, they're preserved largely because of their rich ranching history. And so there are certain landscape obligations that we have, like we can't, maybe just to give you an example, maybe an area we determined that pre-Columbus it was a woodland, there was a bunch of trees, but it has since been transformed and it was ranched, and they want to preserve that look. It's not to say that we can't put in native vegetation, but the trees probably we couldn't do, right? Because it would completely change the look. So the answer is we now, as restoration ecologists, this idea that we are going to return things back to a pristine or historical state is not always realistic. And that's not to say that we shouldn't try to do something. There's a lot that we can do, and we try to make it the best that we can. And instead, we're thinking of it and approaching it by thinking of purpose and function. We can make these areas functional and beneficial to the ecology. Climate change is another issue. Maybe pre-Columbus, these areas looked a certain way that they're not, if we were to turn it back to what it used to be, it's just not going to survive 50 years into the future with the changing climate. So we need to think of all of these things and think in a more functional approach about making it the best that it can be, rather than what it actually was before. But that's a great question. It's a philosophical question, and it's something restoration ecologists are always discussing and talking about now.
So let me just double check. Sonia, if you can hear me, were we able to answer your question? I don't know if Joey answered it all, considering it was similar to Tori's question as far as how are sites determined and project locations and restoration projects. I wonder if she can hear me.
Yeah, I think it was mostly answered. Hi, Joey.
Hey, Sonia.
I guess what I'm really interested in is there's obviously, like you were saying, kind of selling points to certain areas that you picked, but what are some other considerations? Like if you were just taking Satwewa and taking into considerations actually the things you were just saying about making it functional and what all plays into that, how do you pick where you would even start? Like the Yerba Manza, how did you pick that exact point to start planting out?
Yeah, I mean, with every project, you need to write up justifications for it, and so that point, that Yerba Mansa area was chosen largely because of the Yerba Mansa. I mean, I can't think of another spot in the mountains where, like, I can't think of I'm trying to think if there's anywhere else in the mountains that has that much Yerba Mansa and that much interesting native vegetation. I know of places in Ventura, but yeah, I mean, that's exactly it. Like, if I can give you an example too about, the goldfields bloom that over at Paramount, maybe a lot of you have seen that. There's not many places in the Santa Monica Mountains where you see that. Maybe two other places, Malibu Creek State Park, Triunfo Creek Park. There's a beautiful bloom of goldfields there too, but you don't really see that in too many places. And although that's not like a sensitive species, you could make an argument for why that should be preserved and why you'd want to enhance the habitat there. And it's up to the funding source. Do they want to support that? Is it something they're asking for? I mean, maybe they think that's important, and they're asking, you guys looking to preserve wildflower blooms, for example. But yeah, so with the Yerba Mansa, that was a big selling point. That look, there's this ephemeral wetland here. It's dominated by Yerba Mansa. We don't see that very often. we should enhance it. And then also they were arguing, the argument was to, the justification, I'm sorry, was to turn it into improved bird habitat as well.
And then this one's a good one too. So black mustard appear to cover most of Southern California following the raining season between 2018 and 2019. They're asking, how do we address such a widespread invasion? And how do we just give up and acknowledge that black mustard could possibly be our new native plant?
Yeah. So it's another great question because so I mentioned before earlier, we have that list of 25 priority invasive species that we consider to be most ecologically damaging that we go after. The black mustard is not on that list, even though it's incredibly damaging. And it's exactly for the reason that you're pointing out, that it is so widespread. I mean, there's a deep history with black mustard. It came over with the first settlers. It's been here for a long time. And on a regional scale, there's really not much we can do about that species. However, we can treat it in smaller areas. Like if it is threatening, for example, the Lion's Pitacia or the Verides dudleya, of course, then we'd want to go after it on a smaller scale. It'll never be native just by definition. It is an invasive species. It was brought over because it is evolved in a different geographic region. It is native to a different part of the world, and it has been introduced and it's spreading. Then it's invasive. I mean, it's a naturalized invasive species, but it's not. We wouldn't call it native, and it is something we just kind of learned to live with. I think along with annual grasses. Like there's this whole suite of annual grasses that are, again, when you drive along the freeway, you see these brown rolling hills that are, that's all the grasses, the annual grasses. They green up after the rains, then they die pretty early and they stay green. They stay brown over the summer, and they increase the chances of fire happening and ignitions and all that kind of thing. It causes a bunch of problems. But yeah, I don't know, maybe the strip seeding can be a good option for transport. I would love to tackle black mustard on a larger scale and to maybe work in sections, like chip away at the mountains and different parts of the mountains, the black mustard and the annual grasses as well, and try to transform those areas back to some sort of native dominated cover.
So someone also noticed after the Woolsey fire that there were a lot of pretty non-native flowers that obviously were introduced by somebody. And they're wondering if people introducing non-native flowers and seeds may have the idea that it's helping our park because of the fire and they need vegetation to help with the biodiversity. But is there any evidence that it's caused native plant displacement, especially after the Woolsey fire? Have we noticed anything like that?
There were amazing blooms of native species after the Woolsey fire. I did see a lot of small little patches of non-native wildflowers that looked like they came from seed packets. So I'm assuming they were seed bombs that were thrown out the window as people were driving through. And I do know that people think they're helping by throwing seed bombs of non-native species. The answer is that they're not. I don't know that that those seed bombs that I saw, at least from what I saw, that they're causing any sort of major significant problem, at least right now. But because of what we know about non-native species and invasive species and how they can displace our native species, and they can spread very rapidly, then we always highly recommend that people don't do that. I mean, they're not allowed to do it, first of all, at least certainly not on our land, on NPS land. But yeah, it's highly recommended against. The non-native species have not evolved here, and so the native species in general, on average, don't benefit the same way as they do from native species. And that's particularly evident with insects. who, although they will use a lot of the non-native species for nectar, you know, they'll go in and take that sugar water like they do from any other plant. They don't do a good job of eating the leaves. Plants are very good at creating chemical defenses that deter herbivores, and so our native insects who have not evolved with those plants can't benefit in the same way. And so when you start ruining that relationship between insects and plants, which is the most important relationship, you know, the biggest group of herbivores are the insects for plants. Then you start interrupting other relationships, like the birds that eat those insects, that use the protein in those insects to develop their eggs, and it will feed those insects to their young. And those eggs that get eaten by the snakes, and the snakes that get eaten by bobcats, and you guys see where I'm going with it, right? So it'll slowly, those non-native species can, what appears to our eyes, be slowly infiltrate the native areas and displace natives, but it's actually happening extremely quickly when you look at the history of our native plants.
I have a quick question. So if I saw the 3 plants on the list that were invasives and we were really wanting to tackle, and I thought, cool, every time I'm out, I'm just gonna, you know, bring gloves and rip them as I see them. Is that a bad idea, and why? If so.
No, it's not a bad idea. You just need to go through the training, and I can meet you and show you what to do. We do have several volunteers who do that, who go out and they target some of the invasive species that are on our list, and they do it independently. And I've met with them, I've put them through the training, because there is safety training for a lot of these species, like poison hemlock, for example. But we have other species like carnation spurge that have that are also toxic. You know, you can't, if you get in your eyes, it can cause temporary blindness and all kinds of stuff. And so you just need to be aware of that. And there's also native species that can look a lot like our like the invasive species that we have. So it's important for us to distinguish the difference between them. But otherwise, yeah, we sign you up as a volunteer. You track your hours, and if you want to be pulling stuff when you're hiking, that's fine. We'll make sure you have the proper personal protective equipment and that you're trained up on safety and the appropriate way to do it.
Awesome. Is there any other questions you want to ask Joey directly? Oh, Lynn, he did have a slide up. You could just email the volunteer email if you're interested in volunteering with Joey, and we'll route your email to him or Antonio Sanchez. But are there any other questions?
So I would send the email to you, rather?
You can send it to the volunteer email, the one, yeah. Just send it to that, either myself, Lay, or Sarah. It's an email system that we all have access to in case one of us are out of the office, and we could forward the volunteer request to Joey and Antonio, and they'll touch base with you that way as well.
All right, thank you, Rosa.
Yeah. All right, anybody else? Well, Joey, thanks a lot. That was super informative. A lot of people are chatting that they really enjoyed it. Really liked your spunk. It was it was funny. You're a comedian. I didn't know that.
No.
But thanks everybody for joining us today, and we'll hopefully see you on Sunday with Tina's presentation. She'll be answering your questions that you gave us. Take care, and we'll see you guys later.
Thank you, everyone.
Hey, everybody.
All right, bye.
Take care.
Joey.
Bye.
Thank you.